By the end of 2025, the name Jeffrey Epstein still had the power to paralyze institutions, unsettle governments, and inflame public distrust. On December 19, 2025, the U.S. Department of Justice quietly uploaded a series of documents to its website. Within minutes, the servers slowed. Within hours, they crashed. The files, thousands of pages long, heavily redacted, and years overdue, were labeled simply Epstein. For many Americans, this was not closure, it was a reopening. The release reignited one of the most corrosive scandals in modern U.S. history, one that fused wealth, power, sexual exploitation, and institutional failure into a story that refuses to end neatly. Despite official conclusions, criminal convictions, and congressional hearings, the Epstein case has never truly settled. It lingers, resurfacing whenever new information appears or fails to. This time was different. Unlike previous document dumps ordered by courts or released through civil litigation, these files were published under a new federal transparency mandate, passed after bipartisan pressure from lawmakers and survivor advocates. The law required the Justice Department to release all unclassified materials related to Epstein and his network. What emerged instead was a compromise, partial disclosure. Thousands of pages were released, entire paragraphs were blacked out, names were missing, dates were obscured, context was often absent. And yet, what was visible was enough to provoke outrage. Why these files matter? Jeffrey Epstein was not merely a criminal, he was a stress test for the American justice system. Between the late 1990s and his death in 2019, Epstein cultivated relationships with billionaires, heads of state, intelligence figures, Wall Street executives, celebrities, and royalty. At the same time, federal prosecutors allowed him to avoid meaningful punishment for years, even after credible evidence of sexual abuse involving minors emerged. The Epstein case forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when crime intersects with power? The 2025 file release was supposed to answer that question. Instead, it exposed how incomplete the public record still is, and how fiercely institutions continue to guard it. What was released and what wasn't? According to the Department of Justice, the initial release included FBI evidence inventories, interview summaries, flight logs, photographs, internal correspondence, case tracking documents dating back to the early 2000s. However, officials emphasized that redactions were extensive due to protection of victims' identities, ongoing investigations, national security exemptions, and legal obligations involving sealed records. Critics countered that the redactions went far beyond victim protection. In some files, entire pages were blacked out, leaving only page numbers and dates visible. In others, names of associates were replaced with generic labels such as Individual A or Public Figure Number 3. For transparency advocates, the result felt familiar. Information released, but truth withheld. Political backlash and public distrust. Within hours of the release, lawmakers from both parties issued statements accusing the Justice Department of non-compliance with the law's intent. Some called for subpoenas, others threatened contempt proceedings. Survivor advocacy groups were even more direct. This is not transparency, it is institutional self-protection disguised as disclosure. The public reaction was swift and polarized. On social media, the phrase Epstein Files trended nationwide. Conspiracy theories surged alongside legitimate criticism. Old photos resurfaced, stripped of context and weaponized for speculation. The DOJ responded by promising additional releases in stages, though no firm timeline was provided. For many Americans, that explanation rang hollow. A case built on delays. To understand why the Epstein Files provoke such fury, one must understand the pattern that defines this case: delay. Delayed prosecution, delayed accountability, delayed transparency. Even Epstein's death came before a full public reckoning could occur. The result is a vacuum, one filled with mistrust. Each partial release deepens that mistrust, reinforcing the perception that some people remain beyond reach, protected not by innocence, but by proximity to power. What this investigation will examine. This deep dive will examine who Jeffrey Epstein was and how he gained extraordinary access, how his crimes allegedly operated over decades, the failures of prosecutors and regulators, the role of wealth and influence, what the newly released files actually show, what they conspicuously avoid revealing, and why the idea of a client list persists, and whether justice is still possible. This is not a story about rumor. It is a story about systems. The core question. At its heart, the Epstein Files raise a question that extends far beyond one man. Can a democracy confront crimes committed in its most elite circles, or does power ultimately determine who faces consequences? The 2025 file release do not answer that question, but they force it back into the open. Who was Jeffrey Epstein, really? The making of a man who moved freely among the powerful. Jeffrey Edward Epstein presented himself as a financier of unusual discretion. He spoke softly, avoided publicity, and claimed to manage wealth for a tiny circle of ultra-rich clients. He owned no visible hedge fund, released no performance reports, and gave few interviews. Yet for decades, Epstein moved effortlessly through the highest levels of global power: private jets, presidential palaces, elite universities, and gated estates, leaving behind a trail of questions that have never been fully answered. Understanding Epstein is essential to understanding why the files released in 2025 matter so much. His crimes did not occur in isolation. They were enabled by a life built on access without scrutiny. From Brooklyn to privilege. Epstein was born in Brooklyn in 1953 to working-class parents. By his own account, he was gifted in mathematics and physics, though records of formal academic achievement are thin. He attended Cooper Union briefly, later enrolling at New York University, but left without a degree. Still, by his early 20s, Epstein had landed an unlikely position teaching math at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most elite private academies. Dalton catered to children of Wall Street executives, diplomats, and intellectuals. Epstein lacked teaching credentials, yet his intellect and confidence impressed senior administrators. Among those who noticed him was Alan Ace Greenberg, then CEO of the investment bank Bear Stearns and a Dalton parent. This connection would change Epstein's life. Wall Street without a track record. In 1976, Epstein joined Bear Stearns despite having no formal finance background. He rose quickly, working in the firm's options trading division. Colleagues later described him as intelligent but abrasive, ambitious but secretive. In 1981, Epstein left or was pushed out of Bear Stearns under murky circumstances. Official explanations were vague. Epstein would later claim he was recruited to manage money independently for wealthy clients. What followed was the most enduring mystery of his career. How did Epstein become rich? There is no public evidence that he ever managed a large fund. No regulatory filings detail a conventional investment operation. And yet, by the late 1980s, Epstein was purchasing multi-million-dollar properties, including a sprawling Manhattan mansion. The Epstein Files, released decades later, offer no clear answer. They show investigators asking the same question and failing to resolve it. The clients he never named. Epstein frequently claimed that his wealth came from managing money for a small group of billionaires. Among those he cited publicly was Leslie Wexner, the retail magnate behind Victoria's Secret and L brands. Wexner granted Epstein extraordinary authority, including power of attorney over significant assets. Epstein moved into Wexner's mansion and oversaw personal finances. This relationship alone set off alarm bells among investigators. Epstein, with no public track record, controlled enormous sums and wielded unusual influence. By the early 1990s, Epstein was no longer simply wealthy, he was embedded. Access as currency. Epstein understood something fundamental about elite circles. Access breeds legitimacy. He cultivated friendships with politicians, academics, scientists, royal figures, media executives. He donated to universities. He hosted dinners with Nobel laureates. He funded research initiatives attaching his name to prestigious institutions. In return, he gained what money alone could not buy: social insulation. Photos later surfaced of Epstein with presidents, princes, and celebrities. These images, many included again in the 2025 file release, are among the most misunderstood aspects of the case. Association, legally speaking, is not evidence of wrongdoing, but socially it mattered. Being seen with powerful people shielded Epstein from suspicion, and when allegations surfaced, they slowed institutional responses. The private jet and the island. By the late 1990s, Epstein's lifestyle had reached a scale that few could access. A private Boeing jet nicknamed the Lolita Express, a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, multiple estates across the U.S. and Europe. Flight logs, some of which appear again in the newly released files, show frequent travel between Epstein's properties and major political and financial hubs. At the time, these movements raised few eyebrows. Private wealth normalized excess. Early warnings and silence. The earliest documented allegations against Epstein emerged in the mid-1990s. Local law enforcement in Florida received complaints about a wealthy man recruiting underage girls for massages. These were not isolated rumors, they were detailed reports. Yet investigations stalled. The Epstein Files reveal internal disagreements between investigators and prosecutors over jurisdiction, evidence thresholds, and political sensitivity. What is clear is that the warning signs were visible. What remains unclear is why they were not acted upon decisively. The power of plausible deniability. Epstein's genius, if it can be called that, was not financial, it was strategic. He operated in a gray zone, where money was offshore, associations were indirect, transactions were informal, influence was implied, not documented. This made him difficult to pin down. When questions arose, he deflected with confidence. When scrutiny intensified, he invoked powerful names, sometimes accurately, sometimes ambiguously. The files show investigators repeatedly frustrated by Epstein's ability to stay just ahead of accountability. A man hiding in plain sight. By the time federal authorities began paying serious attention to Epstein in the early 2000s, he was already deeply entrenched. He was not an outsider exploiting the system, he was inside it. That distinction matters, because the Epstein case is not only about individual criminal acts, it is about how institutions respond, or fail to, when those acts involve people who operate above ordinary scrutiny. Understanding who Epstein was helps explain why the 2025 file release is so unsatisfactory to many observers. The documents describe a man investigators could see, follow, and question, but rarely corner. They reveal a pattern of institutional hesitation that mirrors Epstein's own evasiveness, and they reinforce a truth that makes this case so enduring. Jeffrey Epstein did not succeed because no one knew. He succeeded because knowing was not enough. Arrest, death, and doubt. the final days of Jeffrey Epstein and the questions that will not go away. On July 6, 2019, more than a decade after his controversial plea deal, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again, this time by federal authorities in New York. For survivors, it felt like vindication delayed. For the justice system, it was a second chance. That chance would last just 36 days. The arrest that reopened everything. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York charged Epstein with sex trafficking of minors, alleging crimes committed between 2002 and 2005. The indictment described a systematic pattern of abuse, recruitment of underage girls, use of employees to facilitate access, payments to victims. Unlike 2008, the charges were federal. The potential sentence was severe. Epstein pleaded not guilty. He was denied bail after prosecutors argued he posed a flight risk, citing private aircraft, offshore assets, history of influence. Epstein was remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in Manhattan. The jail that was not ready. MCC was already under strain. Severe understaffing, infrastructure failures, federal inspections citing unsafe conditions. The Epstein Files released in 2025 include internal Bureau of Prisons correspondence acknowledging these failures. They do not suggest homicide, but they confirm that protocol was repeatedly violated. Why doubt persisted? The disbelief surrounding Epstein's death did not arise in a vacuum. It was shaped by his history of avoiding accountability, the 2008 plea deal, his proximity to powerful individuals, the timing just before potential testimony. When trust is already eroded, coincidence feels implausible. Official conclusions. Multiple investigations concluded Epstein died by suicide. The New York City Medical Examiner, the Department of Justice Inspector General, independent reviews. No evidence of foul play was found. 2 guards were later charged with falsifying records. The cases ended without prison sentences. Institutional accountability remained limited. What the files add. The 2025 Epstein Files do not overturn official conclusions. What they add is texture. Emails expressing concern over MCC conditions, logs documenting missed checks, evidence of bureaucratic inertia. They show a system stretched thin, yet still responsible. The end of a case and the start of a legend. Epstein's death ended the criminal case against him. It did not end public interest. Instead, it transformed Epstein from a defendant into a symbol of elite impunity, of institutional failure, of unanswered questions. For survivors, it meant no trial, no testimony, no public reckoning. A justice system without a verdict. Legally, Epstein's death closed the case. Socially, it opened something else. The Epstein Files released years later reflect this unresolved tension. They read like records of an investigation cut short. Threads followed, then abandoned. The most important witness was gone. Why this moment still defines everything. Had Epstein stood trial, evidence would have been tested, claims would have been challenged, responsibility could have been apportioned. Instead, the system was left with fragments, and fragments invite interpretation. The core paradox. The Epstein case now exists in 2 parallel forms, a legal conclusion and a cultural suspicion. Both are real, neither is complete. The files released in 2025 sit uneasily between them. The first cover-up, how the justice system failed. The 2008 plea deal that changed everything. If there is a single moment when the Epstein case shifted from a criminal investigation into a national scandal, it is 2008. That year, federal prosecutors in Florida reached an agreement with Jeffrey Epstein that would later be described by judges, legal scholars, and survivor advocates as extraordinary, unprecedented, and indefensible. The newly released Epstein Files do not rewrite this history, but they illuminate how deliberately it unfolded. A case that could have been federal. By the mid-2000s, law enforcement had accumulated multiple victim statements, corroborating witness accounts, physical evidence from Epstein's Palm Beach residence, testimony indicating a recruitment pipeline involving minors. Palm Beach police recommended felony charges. The FBI opened a parallel federal investigation, identifying dozens of potential victims. According to internal memos now public, agents believed they had sufficient evidence to pursue federal sex trafficking charges, offenses that could have carried decades in prison. Instead, the case stalled. Enter Alexander Acosta. At the center of the 2008 deal was Alexander Acosta, then the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. Acosta's office negotiated directly with Epstein's high-powered legal team, which included former U.S. Solicitor General, prominent defense attorneys, and influential political intermediaries. The negotiations were conducted largely out of public view. What emerged was a non-prosecution agreement so unusual that it later drew bipartisan condemnation. The terms of the deal. Under the agreement, Epstein pleaded guilty to state prostitution charges. Federal charges were dropped. Epstein served 13 months in county jail. He was allowed work release 6 days a week. Identified co-conspirators were granted immunity. Victims were not notified before the deal was finalized. The last point would later prove legally significant and devastating. Why victims were kept in the dark. Federal law requires prosecutors to consult victims before finalizing plea deals in cases involving violent crime. Internal emails released years later and echoed in the 2025 files show prosecutors were aware of this obligation. They chose to bypass it. One memo explicitly discusses delaying notification until after the deal was signed, citing concerns that victims might object. They did, but by then it was too late. Jail in name only. Epstein's incarceration bore little resemblance to punishment. During his sentence, he left jail daily for up to 12 hours. He worked from a private office. He returned each night. He faced no meaningful restrictions on communication. Local officials later admitted the arrangement was highly irregular. To survivors, it felt like confirmation that Epstein was untouchable. Internal dissent. The Epstein Files revealed that not everyone agreed with the deal. Some federal investigators objected. Some local law enforcement officials protested. Some career prosecutors expressed discomfort. Their objections were overruled. The files show no evidence of direct orders from Washington, but they do show institutional deference to Epstein's defense team and concerns about litigation risk. A deal with long shadows. The consequences of the 2008 agreement were immediate and lasting. Epstein avoided federal prison. Potential co-conspirators were shielded. Survivors were silenced. Public scrutiny faded. Most significantly, Epstein continued to live freely, traveling, hosting guests, and expanding his social network. According to later civil lawsuits, abuse allegedly continued during this period. The deal comes back to haunt the DOJ. In 2018, investigative reporting brought the plea deal back into the spotlight. Survivors filed lawsuits alleging the government violated their rights. In 2019, a federal judge ruled that prosecutors had indeed violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act. The ruling did not undo the deal, but it formally acknowledged institutional wrongdoing. The Epstein Files, released in 2025, reinforce this conclusion. Why this was not merely an error in judgment. Critics argued the plea deal was not merely an error in judgment, but a systemic failure. It reflected disproportionate influence of elite defense counsel, prosecutorial fear of losing a complex case, institutional reluctance to confront powerful defendants. Whether motivated by caution or complicity, the result was the same. Justice was deferred. The trust deficit. The 2008 deal is the reason every subsequent development in the Epstein case is viewed with skepticism. It explains why the public doubts official conclusions, why redactions fuel suspicion, why transparency demands remain intense. Once trust is broken at this scale, it is difficult to restore. The central irony. The files make one thing painfully clear. The justice system did not fail because it lacked information. It failed because it chose restraint where resolve was required. That choice reshaped the next decade.
The alleged crimes and the victims who were ignored. How abuse was allegedly systematized, normalized, and silenced. Any investigation into Jeffrey Epstein inevitably reaches a point where wealth, power, and speculation must give way to something far more difficult: the voices of those who say they were harmed. For years, those voices were dismissed, doubted, or delayed. The Epstein Files, released in 2025, do not introduce new criminal charges, but they do something equally consequential. They reinforce a record that shows how credible allegations accumulated while decisive action lagged behind. This part of the story is not about intrigue, it is about failure. The earliest accusations. According to police records and civil filings, allegations against Epstein began surfacing publicly in the mid-1990s. Girls, some as young as 14, reported being approached with offers of money for massages at Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. The pattern described in sworn statements and police interviews was consistent. A young girl would be recruited, often through school or social connections. She would be brought to Epstein's residence. She would be asked to perform or receive a massage. Sexual contact would allegedly follow. She would be paid cash afterward. Some accusers said they were encouraged to recruit other girls, creating a self-perpetuating system. This was not hidden in shadowy corners. It was reported to authorities. What the files show. The 2025 document release includes police interview summaries, victim statements with identities redacted, internal law enforcement notes, evidence logs documenting seized items. These records show investigators recognized a pattern early on. One internal memo noted the striking consistency of victim accounts. Another acknowledged that the number of potential victims was likely significantly higher than those already identified. Despite this, progress stalled. Why the case did not move faster? Multiple factors contributed to delays. Jurisdictional confusion. Epstein's properties spanned state and federal jurisdictions, complicating responsibility. Victim vulnerability. Many accusers were minors without legal representation or financial resources. Legal intimidation. Epstein's legal team aggressively challenged credibility and threatened civil action. Institutional caution. Prosecutors expressed concern about the political and social sensitivity of the case. The files revealed that some investigators believed they had sufficient evidence for serious charges, but were overruled. The 2008 plea deal, a turning point. The most consequential moment in the Epstein case came in 2008 when federal prosecutors agreed to a secretive plea deal. Under the agreement, Epstein pled guilty to state prostitution charges.
He served 13 months in a county jail. He was allowed to leave jail 6 days a week for work release. Federal charges were dropped. Potential co-conspirators were granted immunity. Most significantly, victims were not informed. This decision would later be described by legal scholars as one of the most controversial prosecutorial agreements in modern history. Survivors speak too late. Many victims only learned of the plea deal after it was finalized. Some describe the moment as a second betrayal. The Epstein Files include correspondence showing prosecutors were aware that the agreement violated standard notification practices, but proceeded anyway. Years later, a federal judge ruled that the government had indeed failed to uphold victims' rights under federal law. But by then, Epstein had already served his sentence and resumed his life of privilege. The cost of silence. The consequences of that plea deal were not abstract. According to later civil lawsuits, abuse allegedly continued after 2008. Several accusers said they assumed Epstein had powerful protection and that reporting him was futile. That assumption was not irrational. It was based on lived experience. The difficulty of proof. One reason the Epstein case remains contentious is the legal standard of proof. Sexual abuse cases, especially those involving minors and delayed reporting, are notoriously difficult to prosecute. But the Epstein Files show something more troubling. Evidence was not absent, it was fragmented, compartmentalized, and deprioritized. No single agency saw or acted on the full picture. The human toll. Behind every redacted name is a person who carried the consequences for years. Interrupted education, long-term psychological trauma, distrust of institutions, public skepticism. Survivors who later testified in court described feelings of shame, fear, and invisibility. Some said they watched Epstein appear in news photos with world leaders while their own lives unraveled. Why this part matters. It is tempting to focus on famous names and sensational theories, but the Epstein case cannot be understood without centering those who lacked power. The files released in 2025 confirm what survivors have long said. Authorities were warned, patterns were recognized, opportunities to intervene existed, and yet decisive action came too late. A systemic failure. The Epstein case exposes how wealth can delay accountability. Complexity can become an excuse. Institutions can prioritize risk management over justice. This is not a story of ignorance. It is a story of choice. The powerful network, association, access, and ambiguity. What the files show, what they don't, and why that distinction matters. Few aspects of the Epstein case generate more heat and less clarity than the question of who else was involved. The 2025 release of Epstein-related files intensified this focus. Social media erupted with screenshots of flight logs, photographs, and partially redacted names. Old images resurfaced, new speculation followed. But the documents themselves tell a more restrained, complicated story, one that resists easy conclusions. This part of the investigation examines what the files actually demonstrate, what they leave unresolved, and why the distinction between association and culpability is critical to any credible understanding of the case. Why the network question dominates. Jeffrey Epstein did not live like an isolated predator. He lived like a connector. He hosted dinners, funded academic programs, and traveled with an ever-changing roster of guests. He cultivated proximity to power as a form of social capital. This inevitably raises the question, did Epstein act alone, or was he part of a broader system of exploitation? The files released in 2025 do not provide a definitive answer, but they do clarify how Epstein positioned himself and why suspicion persists. What appears in the files? The documents include flight logs from Epstein's private aircraft, contact lists and phone directories, photographs of Epstein with public figures, visitor records from his properties, interview summaries referencing third parties. These materials confirm that Epstein interacted with many influential individuals across politics, finance, academia, and entertainment. What they do not establish is criminal behavior by those individuals. That gap between presence and proof is where controversy thrives. Flight logs, evidence or misinterpreted data. Flight logs are among the most widely circulated materials. They document dates, aircraft tail numbers, passenger names, sometimes, destinations. Some logs show well-known figures flying on Epstein's plane. Others list staff, pilots, or unnamed passengers. Crucially, appearing on a flight log does not indicate knowledge of or participation in criminal acts. Flights occurred over many years for various purposes. Some individuals listed deny ever flying or say names were added without their knowledge. The files include internal FBI notes cautioning against overinterpretation of these records. Still, flight logs remain potent symbols because they imply access. Photographs and their limits. Photos released in 2025 include Epstein standing beside politicians at public events, business leaders at fundraisers, celebrities at social gatherings. These images are often stripped of context online. In journalistic terms, they demonstrate social proximity, not criminal conspiracy. Investigators repeatedly note this distinction in the files, sometimes explicitly. One internal memo warns that photographic association alone is insufficient for evidentiary purposes. That warning is often ignored in public discourse. The absence of a client list. Perhaps the most persistent belief surrounding Epstein is the existence of a secret client list, a definitive record of powerful individuals who participated in abuse. The files released in 2025 do not contain such a list. Neither do prior court records, indictments, or sealed filings made public through litigation. Federal officials have consistently stated that no comprehensive client list was ever found. Names that appear in documents do so in varied, non-uniform contexts. This does not mean Epstein acted alone, but it does mean the popular conception of a single incriminating document is unsupported by evidence. Why the belief persists. The belief in a hidden list endures for several reasons. Historical precedent. Epstein's 2008 plea deal created suspicion that others were protected. Redactions, blacked-out names invite speculation. Power asymmetry. Epstein's connections defy simple explanations. Incomplete accountability. Epstein died before trial. The files unintentionally reinforce mistrust by revealing how much remains withheld. Named but not accused. Some high-profile individuals appear in the Epstein records through scheduling emails, fundraising events, academic donations, travel coordination. In many cases, no allegation of wrongdoing accompanies the reference. Individuals have publicly denied any knowledge of abuse. Some cooperated with investigators. The files distinguish carefully between witnesses, associates, and subjects of investigation, a nuance often lost outside legal contexts. Co-conspirators and open questions. The files do confirm that investigators believed Epstein did not operate entirely alone. They reference facilitators, employees, intermediaries. Some of these individuals were charged or convicted. Why? The documents suggest familiar obstacles, insufficient evidence meeting criminal standards, statutes of limitation, witness fatigue, prosecutorial discretion. These explanations satisfy legal frameworks, but not public curiosity.
What comes next? Legacy, limits, and the meaning of justice. By the time the Epstein Files were released in late 2025, the criminal justice system had already reached its formal conclusion. Jeffrey Epstein was dead. No trial would ever test the evidence in open court. No jury would weigh testimony. No verdict would be delivered. And yet, the case was not over. It had simply changed form. A legal case closed, a public case open. Legally, there is little left to adjudicate. Epstein's death extinguished criminal liability. The statute of limitations closed avenues for many potential charges against others. Civil cases have largely been settled or dismissed. But the Epstein Files underscore a different reality. Justice is not only a legal outcome. It is also accountability, transparency, institutional reform, public trust. By those measures, the case remains unresolved. Ongoing and potential consequences. The 2025 file release triggered several developments, even if none amounted to criminal prosecutions. Congressional oversight. Lawmakers renewed calls for hearings on prosecutorial discretion, redaction standards, and the handling of elite defendants. Internal reviews. The Department of Justice acknowledged renewed internal audits of past decision-making, though details remain limited. Policy reform debates. Advocacy groups pushed for changes to plea deal transparency, victim notification enforcement, and independent review of non-prosecution agreements. These steps are incremental, but they reflect an enduring discomfort with how the Epstein case unfolded. The question of others. One of the most persistent public questions is whether others will ever face legal consequences. The Epstein Files suggest why that outcome is unlikely. Evidence is fragmented. Time has eroded prosecutorial options. Many references lack corroboration sufficient for criminal charges. This reality frustrates the public, but it also reflects the constraints of the legal system. Justice, in this sense, is limited by proof, timing, and due process. The survivor's legacy. Perhaps the most enduring impact of the Epstein case lies with the survivors. Their actions forced renewed investigation, exposed institutional failure, changed public conversation around power and abuse. Some have said the files brought little comfort. Others argue that even partial truth matters, that documentation itself is a form of acknowledgement. Both views can coexist. What is clear is that without survivor persistence, the Epstein story might have ended quietly in 2008. Institutional self-examination, or lack thereof. The Epstein Files raise an uncomfortable question about institutional learning. Have lessons been absorbed? The documents show awareness without urgency, information without coordination, power without accountability. Whether those patterns persist remains an open question, one not answered by document releases alone. The media's responsibility going forward. The Epstein case also leaves a challenge for journalism. The temptation to speculate remains strong, especially when official records are incomplete. But the files demonstrate why restraint matters. Careful reporting must distinguish allegation from proof, avoid guilt by association, center victims rather than spectacle. The legacy of this case depends as much on how it is told as on what is known. What justice looks like when a verdict is impossible. The Epstein case may ultimately redefine justice not as a single outcome, but as a process. Justice here may mean acknowledging institutional failure, recording the truth as fully as possible, preventing repetition, refusing to let power erase accountability. This is an imperfect form of justice, but it may be the only one available. The final truth of the files. The Epstein files do not reveal a hidden master narrative. They reveal something quieter and more disturbing: that a system can see wrongdoing, understand its implications, and still hesitate, especially when the wrongdoer is powerful. That hesitation, more than any conspiracy, defines the case. An uncomfortable conclusion. Jeffrey Epstein exploited people, but he also exploited systems, their caution, their fragmentation, their deference to influence. The files released in 2025 confirm this pattern in black ink and redaction bars. They are not a smoking gun. They are a mirror. Epilogue. History will likely remember the Epstein case not for a single crime, but for what it exposed about inequality before the law. The question it leaves behind is not who escaped accountability, but whether the system has learned to prevent the next one. That answer remains unwritten.